Hello, my name is Brant Hunt. Getting a little later this night. I've been doing a few videos today, trying to make people aware of what's happened in the past that official history actually doesn't deal with. I'm going to be reading a next chapter that is actually looks like it's going to be the second chapter, if I recall well. Without Shelter. This is a book by James Baque, Bacque, a Canadian. This was written back in 1989, as well as I recollect. And unfortunately, I don't know if he's still alive or not, because I think he was a soldier, so himself a Canadian soldier. If you want to read this book, I suggest you could get it from Amazon. I've seen it there. So I remember I checked out the book at the library years ago. Didn't have internet like this. We could share things like this, but I want to share this because I think it's vitally important to share it with you to show what really goes on. And I'm tired of the lying. So this is starting at chapter 2 with Without Shelter. This is the report here. My heart is saddened by the tales of the mass of German women and children flying along the roads everywhere in 40-mile long columns to the west before the advancing Russian army. I am clearly convinced they deserved it, but that does not remove it from one's gaze. The misery of the whole world appalls me. It's a quote from Winston Churchill. Well, Winston, you should have realized that the war itself is hell. So my point simply is, why did your country and why did you actually push war with Germany? I believe your words are really futile in this remark because I know that you are involved in this whole thing because you're the prime minister and your life reveals that you've always been bloodthirsty. So I don't know. You just wrote this through this comment here as a joke. So Winston Churchill, seeing the Germans suffer the fate he had feared for his own countrymen, was not a vengeful mood as the last big three conference of the war opened in Yalta in February 1945. Maybe most of you people may think I'm being very cruel with Winston Churchill, but I've read many things about Winston Churchill that is appalling. Okay, so it doesn't make me. You may say these things in the public, but that's not the real Churchill. You see, it's a pretty face, cosmetic face here, but not the real face. Roosevelt stared grimly from his car at the destruction caused by the retreating Germans. Caused by it. As soon as he saw Stalin, he said that destruction made him feel more bloodthirsty than ever towards the Germans. Stalin replied that he hadn't seen anything. The destruction in the Ukraine was much worse. Then Roosevelt responded, "If I hope you will again propose a toast to this execution of 50,000 officers of German officers, that is." When the subject of German future came up in the second section the next day, Stalin, if the Allies could agree on some plan for dismemberment of Germany, to be specific, to any German anti-Nazi group seeking peace. Churchill said he saw no need for this without adding that he opposed the country's division. Stalin raised the subject again near the end of the conference, accusing Churchill of opposing dismemberment because he wanted to do business with a strong Germany. Churchill, he had already told Roosevelt that he feared having no strong nation between the white cliffs of Dover and the white snows of Russia, retorted that there was no point in bleeding Germany white because she would collapse, as she had before, under the weight of reparations. Dismemberment, or the Morgenthau plant, now temporarily in abeyance, would make reparations even more burdensome. Roosevelt suggested a compromise. The three foreign secretaries should produce a plan for Germany's dismemberment within 30 days. Churchill deferred to Roosevelt. Once again, major decisions about the future of Germany were about to be postponed. But Stalin this time would not allow the issue of repreparation to disappear into a committee. Hissing his words as he squeezed his chair so hard his knuckles turned white, he insisted that Russia have a right to recompense for the vast devastation caused by Germany. Not a single usable house could be seen on the long flight from Moscow to the Polish frontier. Reluctantly, Churchill and Roosevelt agreed to take the figure of 20 billion as a basis for discussion, or any agreed amount. Russia would get half. Yet Stalin's attitude to prisoners of war, who would supply a vast pool of slave labor for reparations after the war, was very casual. When asked later by Harry Hopkins, a special assistant to Roosevelt, what he was doing with the prisoners Russia had taken, he said vaguely that he thought they were being made to work. The refugees noted by Churchill soon included millions of soldiers of the Wehrmacht seeking to escape the Russians as they fled to the haven in the west. An arrogant and heartless army, if there ever was one, the Wehrmacht of 1940 and 41, had by now been destroyed on the Eastern Front. About half of its soldiers now were teenagers or men over 35, many running away to the Western Allies who they thought would treat them better than the Russians. While the war lasted, Eisenhower and his staff were responsible for the care and feeding of all prisoners according to the Geneva Convention. What he actually did with these men was largely determined by what Hitler did with about 2 million French, American, British, and Canadian soldiers in his prison camps. Besides the Western soldiers, many more millions of Russians had fallen into his hands. Many of the Russians were now presumed dead because of the harsh conditions imposed by the Germans. The Geneva Convention provided the rules for the treatment of prisoners. The only enforcement was the threat of retaliation against prisoners. However, Eisenhower complained after the Allied victory in North Africa in May 1943 that he had never been told in Staff College what to do with prisoners when transport was scarce. He sought help from his old friend, General Edward S. Hughes, who had been with him at Staff College at Fort Leavenworth in Kansas. Hughes was named Eisenhower's special assistant with an office at the headquarters of the Communications Zone, called COMZ in Paris after its liberation in August of 44. Here he kept an eye on manpower replacement, prisoner of war rations, and General J.C.H. Lee, who was in charge of logistics for the European theater of operation. Nobody knew quite what he did, but he did a lot, said Bo L. Weave. I said it's B-U-E-L-F. Weave, W-E-A-R-E, officer of the staff of Eisenhower at quartermaster. He was one of the inner circle boys. Hughes was a tall, impressive man, saturnine and quiet in manner. Eisenhower trusted Hughes completely because he thought that Hughes was a man of the highest ability and great integrity. Hughes understood Eisenhower's method of management by winks and nods. Hughes was welcome in the bosom of the Eisenhower family, where he was called Uncle Everett. Eisenhower helped Hughes to rise in the Army in several ways. For instance, in February of 1944, Eisenhower signaled to General McNarney, spelled M-C-N-A-R-N-E-Y, in Washington. He now wanted General Hughes back beside him at the Supreme Command of the Allied Expedition Forces in Europe. I can use General Hughes very advantageously in this theater. Request your issue order, transfer him at once. Hughes was immediately transferred to Europe to help Eisenhower. There he became, in Eisenhower's words, my ears and my eyes. Eisenhower depended on Hughes because he was loyal, efficient above all discreet. Discretion was vital to Eisenhower because he never liked to take direct actions requiring his personal participation, which indirect methods could accomplish the same results. This characteristic, later described by his vice president, Richard M. Nixon, was fully developed when Eisenhower was running the Supreme Command in the Allied Air and Expeditionary Forces in Europe in 1944. General George S. Patton commented on it in the letter to Beatrice Patton. I assume that's his wife, describing how difficult it was to get a decision from Eisenhower, who did not like people to know what was in his mind or on controversial subjects. Patton said, "It's hell to wage war by inadvertency and to conquer by deceit." As Eisenhower's grandson David wrote, Eisenhower developed the habit of confronting even the proposals he favored with skepticism or a sharp no. General Lucas Clay explained he discovered a lot of weak people that way. This method required the service of subtle subordinates who knew how to rule by indirection. Even when he was in a position to issue clear and direct orders, he apparently preferred to work by more tortuous methods. He moved by stealth. Sometimes his order was so unclear that he had to issue clarification the next day. This frustration sometimes made him terribly angry. As Hughes noted on July 21st, 1944, the man is crazy. He won't issue orders that stick. He will pound on the desk and shout. Hughes has great influence but little direct authority. His subtle methods disguise the origins of policy. For instance, although rations were reduced in May by Eisenhower's command, the order itself has not survived. The junior officers were showing some reluctance in the initial stage if they had asked for written orders. Hughes just could not have complied without getting Eisenhower's signature. This policy was so thoroughly established that in October 1945, when a special feeding of prisoners was ordered for publicity purposes. Wow. The officer in charge demanded written orders from Eisenhower before he would comply. Policy was thus carried out by denial of essential food and other supplies without written orders. Everything was done by doing nothing. Eisenhower made very clear the limits on Hughes' authority in his letters on February 24, 1944, when he appointed Hughes. Eisenhower wrote, emphasis will be placed on the consultant aspect of your duties rather than on the inspection aspect. After discussing them with responsible commanders, bring to me any problems which, in your opinion, require my decision at theater command. It was thorough logistic, perhaps more than any other way, that Eisenhower controlled Montgomery. His authoritarian biographer, Stephen Ambrose, pointed out Montgomery could take an extreme broad view of Eisenhower's orders and, in essence, follow his own inclinations. But he could not conjure up supplies out of thin air. He had to fight within a framework that was tightly constricted by the amount of material Eisenhower chose to give him. Eisenhower's chief of staff, Bedell Smith, wrote that with the needs and assigned missions of the various forces familiar to him, he alone could have the knowledge to allocate the supplies and divisions for the separate operations. Eisenhower had a very high opinion of Hughes' judgment as well as his direct discretion. In the summer of 1944, he descended to Hughes' suggestion that he rewrite an important order, even though this meant issuing an embarrassing clarification only one day after the original. Hughes was one of the very few officers who reported directly to Eisenhower, which enabled them both to deal discreetly with controversial subjects. Eisenhower authorized Hughes to consult and confer with the officers and enlist men of all units, organization, and headquarters of the United States Army, European Theater of Operation, that is, the United States Army. He was to advise others from his great experience and to advise Eisenhower himself on manpower, supplies, and organization. Under this extraordinary, broad-ranging mandate, Hughes could go anywhere and talk to anyone he wanted. Whoever he questioned had to reply or risk displeasing Eisenhower. It's a pretty powerful position. Many and sensitive were the subjects that Hughes handled discreetly. The issues of liquor, Kate Somerville stated, and Eisenhower's driver and sometimes secretary who accompanied him on long trips, patents and description rations for POWs. All these he wrote about in his diary of the period in 1945, part in a French notebook which he had given by General George S. Patton. Hughes and Eisenhower discussed prisoner rations during a walk on August 4, 1944, near Wide Wing, that is, near the Supreme Command headquarters in England. I had a long talk in the woods with Ike, Kate Tedler. I told Ike about replacements, POW, etc., to explain my beef against Lee's use of manpower. In his attitude, he's an international Rotarian. Ike wants me to continue the job, says he doesn't trust Lee. This was significant because of the power over supplies wielded by the scrupulous General J.C.H. Lee, which was nicknamed Jesus Christ himself, who was in charge of logistics for the European Theater of Operations. Through special assistance, Hughes, Eisenhower had the private view he wanted to on logistics and many other areas. Hughes took an extraordinary interest in the ration of POW, which he was constantly reducing below the level set by the subordinate supply officers who based their requisitions for supply on the Geneva Convention provisions that the prisoners must be fed and housed to the same standards as U.S.-based troops. This is why on May 31, 1943, Hughes noted in his diary, I have difficulty in getting German POW rations cut down. In the autumn of 1944, Hughes had a long luncheon with Eisenhower, during which they again discussed rations for prisoners of war. This was becoming a headache for Eisenhower, as he told Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall on September 18. Incidentally, the care of our mass of prisoners constitutes quite a problem. This problem was not new to either Marshall or Eisenhower. In May of 1943, Eisenhower had complained to Marshall about the difficulty of dealing with the several 100,000 German prisoners captured by the Allies in Tunisia. It is a pity we should not, this is what he said. Now, you listen to me, folks. It's a pity we could not have killed more. That's from Eisenhower. He said in the postscript of a letter which has been suppressed from various official editions of the Eisenhower papers. Hughes advised Eisenhower not to issue any orders about feeding POWs and issue of liquor. Hughes passed the measures about the need for secrecy down the line to subordinates officers in Europe on Friday, November 24th. You shouldn't put yours on your staff view about POW rations on paper, he ordered. In other words, it's not going to be put on paper, what they're doing. Further, officers should not say aloud such things as, of course, we must not do anything that will get the theater commander Eisenhower in bad. A week later, Hughes wrote in his diary conference on POW rations in John's office. A hand probably not Hughes had written in Littlejohn for John, meaning Robert Littlejohn, who as quartermaster ETOO was in charge of Eisenhower's supplies. Finally, I think put across the idea that POWs must be fed less and not what the French don't have. He reported this conference directly to Eisenhower the following Monday, told him about the directive to reduce POW rations, which wound up with advice to be careful. Finally got to Littlejohn. Hughes enjoyed Littlejohn. He's a big bear of a man who traveled around France in his own train. Wherever he stopped for breakfast, the morning paper was delivered to him. Hughes worked carefully on him, appealing to Littlejohn's sense of loyalty. On January 18th, he noted wearily that instead of roaring along in Littlejohn's luxurious train, he was forced to go home by car. Continue. Without seeing his friend Brad, Hodges, and Simpson, 7 hours with Codman in a Buick. Elaman stopped at PWE, that's prisoner of war enclosure near Stenay, Stenay. Find Germans eating full B rations. I wonder if I can kick that problem. Another problem he was trying to kick was that Lee had apparently been wasting men in the rear areas on such low priority jobs as guarding and maintaining POW camps. Lee, Hughes noted, traveled by plane or by car, usually followed by his train. The plane he frequently sent to North Africa to bring back oranges for his breakfast. Wow, that's amazing. Among Hughes' odd jottings, which included the amazing number of registered whores in rhymes, 3,000. The size of Eisenhower furlough party going to Candace 12. The request from Eisenhower for silk stockings for Kate and the number of cases of scotch he had been able to wrangle. He frequently mentioned the efforts he is making to reduce the rations of the prisoners. The critical role that Hughes was playing for Eisenhower during these difficulties was emphasized by Eisenhower himself on February 25th, 1944, in a cable to General Somerville, who had asked for Hughes to be returned to Washington. I do not repeat, not desire to spare his services. It would be embarrassing to me to lose him at this junction. I'm sorry I cannot help you out in the matter. The handling of the prisoners at the front of U.S. hands was so disorganized in late 1944 that General Bruce Clark and Patton's fast-moving Third Army, unable to spare any guards, simply disarmed the captives, crushed their weapons under the treads of the tanks, then turned them loose to walk back through France without guards. Many of the surrendered men were beaten up by French civilians. That is Colonel R.J. Gill in the Theater Provost Marshal Office complained in February 1945 that only 7,004 POWs of a shipment originally numbered 17,417 were received by his unit. Several times in March, American guards opening rail cars of prisoners arriving from Germany found them dead inside. At Mally-le-Camp on March 16, 104 were found dead. Further 27 were found dead at Tillichet. During with this irritated Eisenhower because it meant apologizing to Germans. I loved having to apologize to the Germans, he wrote to Marshall in Washington about his investigation into the deaths of the Germans who had accidentally suffocated in boxcars while being shipped. It looks as if this time I have no other recourses. The fear of reprisal against Allied prisoners was nevertheless not enough to make the Army improve its care of POWs. More Germans were soon dead in another incident which Eisenhower did not apologize, probably because the war was almost over and reprisals seemed unlikely. Major General Milton A. Redlican, RCKORD, Theater Provost Marshal, who was then in charge of guarding captives, warned Eisenhower that these two recent incidents resulting in deaths of German POWs were caused by lack of personnel. This lack is so serious and has continued so long that it has become the paramount consideration in every operation of handling POWs. So Recker had already written to the War Department through the European Theater Operation Headquarters, warning them about the increased prisoner load, but in more than a month had received no reply. Part of the problem was that the British and Canadians had not accepted responsibility for all the POWs they were supposed to take over from the U.S. Redeker finished with a stern warning that the possibility of the further deaths concerns the highest level of the ETO and the supreme commanders of the European forces and the War Department. Protests and even reprisals are possible that would affect the standing of the U.S. before world opinion, since high levels would be affected by failure. It seems that the same high levels should know if the personnel is not supplied through normal channels. Eisenhower hated Germans. He told his wife, Mamie, is M-A-M-M, in a letter, September 94. Why? Because the German is a beast. In front of the British ambassador to Washington in August, he said that all 3,500 of his so-called officers, the German general staff, should be exterminated. He would include for liquidation all leaders of the Nazi Party from mayors on up, plus all members of the Gestapo. This would total about 100,000 people. He and his lunch guests agreed that nature could be left to run its course if the Russians were given a free hand to post-war Germany. Eisenhower told them that Germany would be divided in zones, one to each nation which had been overrun, so that justice could be done. As the British and Canadians fought their way into Holland, starvation began to threaten Dutch civilians trapped behind German lines. Eisenhower asked the Germans for help in feeding the Dutch. What do you ask the Germans for? That's interesting. He told Marshall, I am done trifling with them. While I've had held my hand in the fear of intensifying the Dutch suffering, if the Germans doesn't play the game, absolutely, I intend really to punish him when I can turn my attention in that direction. His feelings against the Germans grew stronger the more desperate they fought. The more he saw the horrors of their concentration camps until he felt ashamed that he bore a German name. Fear that chaos would follow war in Europe, resulting in revolutions that would either nullify the sacrifices of American lives or else demand further sacrifices, and made the far-sighted Roosevelt commission his own friend, that is, his old friend named Sam Rosenman, to look into the world food situation. Roosevelt was especially afraid of chaos in France. If the country was starving, the communists would find it easier to unite the final revolution, which they believed would destroy capitalism. That's an amazing statement, isn't it? Yet, in France, you're concerned about France, but you're not. You capitulate with Soviet Union. They're communists too. Anyways, it seems it's just amazing. Some atrocities were already talking about the dangers of a world food shortage, creating a civil unrest all over Europe. In February 1945, Brigadier General T.J. Davis warned Eisenhower that the heavy supply commitment resulting from giving the German prisoners status as POWs could not be met. Rosenman reported to the president in April that shortages in supplies rather than shipping will be the limiting factor within the immediate future. He added mysteriously, supplies will not be called forward or distributed by the Supreme Command in Europe unless it becomes necessary as a matter of military necessity to do so. Two mysteries are contained here. One is the implication previously dismissed that there was in truth enough food for all civilians apart from Germans. The other is phrasing as military necessity in reference to civilians in post-war Germany. Rosenman is obviously thinking, as were the president and Eisenhower, of the possibility of famine causing unrest among German civilians, which would have to be suppressed by the army. The danger was visible in the nation. The danger was visible in the rations allocated for German civilian. The maximum food from all sources was approximately 1,500 calories per head per day. The minimum to maintain life for adult lying down during no work but self-care varies from 1,800 to 2,250 calories per day, according to various experts. The notion of world food shortage was first spread by General Hughes in North Africa in 1943. He wrote in April 1945, the world shortage of food is being talked about. I talked it, that is long ago, starting in North Africa. At that time, and later, the shortage was not of food. In the area now known as West Germany, the population was 4% less than May 1945 than it was in the same area in 1939. Although the German population there was rising every day with the influx of refugees from the east, there was a lot more wheat available in the combined areas of Western Germany, France, and Britain, and Canada, and the U.S. than there had been in the same physical area in 1939. This was because increasing wheat production in North America and the UK more than replaced the production lost in Western Germany and France. The wheat surplus in Canada at the end of both the crop years of 43 and 44 and 44 and 45 were over 440 million bushels. In the U.S., it was the same. There was also a large surplus of corn. The potato crop was down in the overall area by a relatively small amount, caused mainly by the 30% drop in western part of Germany in 45. Nevertheless, in France, wheat production in 1944 was 500,000 tons more than consumption. As Churchill noted to Roosevelt in March 1945, there was no overall shortage of wheat, although sugar, meat, and some fats were scarce for many people in Europe. On the world scale, food production measured in calories per capita for 1945 45 and 46 crop year was 90% of the 1935, 35 to 39 average production, according to the U.S. Office of Foreign Agricultural Relations in October 45. In March, as Germany was being cracked like a nut between the Russians and the Western Allies, a message signed and initiated by Eisenhower proposed a startling departure from the Geneva Convention, the creation of a new class of prisoners who would not be fed by the army after the surrender of Germany. The message dated March 10th reads, although it is intended to place the responsibility for feeding and maintaining all Allied prisoners of war, meaning Germans in Allied hands, and displaced persons upon the German authorities, it is anticipated that in the state of chaos that is likely to exist, this will prove beyond their capacity and that the Allies will be faced with the necessity of providing very large quantities of food pending their reparations. The additional maintenance commitment entailed by declaring the German armed forces, that is, prisoners of war, which would necessitate the provisions of rations on a scale equal to that of base troops, would prove far beyond the capacity of the Allies, even if all German sources were tapped. Moreover, it would be undesirable to place the German armed forces upon a scale of rations far in excess of that available to the civilian population. Prisoners taken after VE Day, victory over Europe, would be called disarmed enemy forces, pending on discharge, administrative, and maintained by the German army under supervision of Allied forces. The measure ended with, your approval is requested. Existing plans have been prepared upon this basis. So that's the end of chapter 2 here. And let's look at the time factor here. It's 27 minutes. So we're going to try to continue. Let's go ahead and do the next chapter. Number 3 is no public declaration. So on April 26, 1945, a message from combined chiefs of staff scattered onto the machines at the Supreme Headquarters of Allied Forces in Reims in response to Eisenhower's message on March 10th, creating the status of disarmed enemy forces. The combined chiefs of staff approved the DEF status for prisoners of war in American hands only. The British members of the CCS refused to adopt the American plan for their own prisoners. The major conditions set forth for Eisenhower were as follows. B. Germans are responsible for feeding and maintaining disarmed German troops. C. Procedure adopted will not apply to war criminals nor to other categories of wanted German personnel nor to other persons found among the German armed forces and retained on security grounds. You will continue to imprison all such persons as suspect war criminals or on grounds of military security and not as prisoners of war. They will be fed, housed, and otherwise administered by the Allied forces. German authorities will exercise no control over them whatsoever. D. There should be no public declaration regarding status of German armed forces or disarmed troops. Under this provision, the contravention of the Geneva Convention was kept secret. They didn't tell anybody. Section 2 of the message read, following statement is added by the British Chief of Staff. If the United Kingdom decides it requires additional prisoners of war, such personnel will not be included by you in the category of disarmed troops. The final section adds, it is assumed that you will have no occasion to declare additional Germans to be prisoners of war after defeat, to meet the labor requirements of the Supreme Command of the Allies in Europe. This refusal to agree on the DEF policy with the Americans is a startling departure from cooperation that the Allies had given each other up to now. The British were obliged to accept prisoners from the Americans in order to share the load more equitably. To refuse prisoners in advance would have been grossly insulting if the Americans had not concurred in advance that the British were justified in doing so. The Americans knew, as well as the British, that any Germans subjected to DEF status would certainly not be fit to work, and most likely they would be dying. Let's continue. The descending British also decided they would not even use the American term DEF for any person whom they knew they could not treat according to the letters of the Geneva Convention. They used the term surrender enemy personnel to distinguish their post-surrender POWs from others. The British refused to accept the American DEFs had been accepted without comment by the American chiefs, but not by the U.S. officer at the Supreme Commanders at the Allied forces. A message signed Eisenhower complained that the British, with their smaller load, are able to maintain higher standards, which by comparison prejudiced the American position. Nothing at this date prevented the Americans from treating their captives as well as the British treating theirs. U.S. supplies, now supplementally by capture stops, were more than adequate for the job. No dissent assisted in amount certain prize prisoners such as war criminals, spies, and high-tech scientists whom the British and Americans were determined should live. They were actually called wanted to distinguish them from the others who were not wanted. Both the British and the Americans specified that these wanted prisoners should not be included in the DFL category, but should be fed, housed, and otherwise administered by the Allied forces. This order not only helped to isolate the suspects in one place for later trial, but also preserved them from the conditions to be imposed by the DF status. Attention was sure to be focused on the famous criminals so that they could not be kept among the DF prisoners. That the conditions of the DEF camps were certain to be unacceptable to the Allied public in Europe and North America was demonstrated with the chiefs' order to Eisenhower that there should be no public declaration regarding status of German armed forces or of disarmed troops. It was scarcely necessary to give this last order, for Eisenhower was already lying to the public about the plans for the prisoners. As a press conference in Paris, he said, "If the Germans want to if the Germans were reasoning like normal human beings, they would realize the whole history of the United States and Great Britain is to be generous towards a defeated enemy. We deserve all the laws of the Geneva Convention." This is from Eisenhower's statement. This convention, which the U.S. government and the United States Army repeatedly said they observed, provided three important rights for the prisoners: that they would be fed and sheltered to the same standards based on the depot troops of the captured power, that they could send and receive mail, and that they had the right to be visited by delegates of the International Committee of Red Cross, who would then report in secret to the protecting power, that is the German government, and to the U.S. authorities. In the case of abuse, the protecting powers could threaten exposure or retaliation. So here's our footnote. Among other denunciations of U.S. occupation policies was a speech by Senator Hendrik Shipstead in 1946 denouncing American eternal monument of shame, the Morgenthau Plan for the destruction of the German people. This was based upon a congressional record in the Senate of May 15, 1946, page 5039. Responsibility for the treatment of German prisoners in American hands belonged to the commanders of the U.S. Army in Europe, subject only to political control by the government. All decisions about prisoner treatment were in fact made solely by the U.S. Army in Europe, except for three basic ones, all of which broke the convention. The decision to prevent the delegates of the International Red Cross from visiting U.S. camps. The ban also applied to British and Canadian camps. The joint U.S.-UK decision to transfer prisoners for reparation labor to the French, provided the French obeyed the convention, and decision to send certain prisoners to Russia against their will. The most important decision, which also broke the convention, was the creation of DFF status, devised by Eisenhower and approved by the CCS, that is part of the American contingents. The chaos which Eisenhower had said would prevent the Germans from feeding themselves was, of course, going to be created in part by the Allies themselves, because they would dismantle the central German institutions, including welfare agencies. They would also hamper or abolish production of a list of over 500 items that the Morgenthau Plan is stipulated. Yet the message said that the Army would place responsibility upon German authorities. There were no authorities to do the maintaining. Once the Army, the government, the welfare agencies, including German Red Cross, and the important elements of trade were abolished. It's asinine what they're doing. It's just blaming. They're throwing away their responsibilities. They're taking all the responsibility of the Germans to take care of their own self because they're going to take care of them, you see. But they're not going to take care of them, you see. As American soldiers were rounding up the beating Germans in the rubble heaps of the rule, suited bureaucrats in Washington were arguing over what to tell Eisenhower to do with those Germans. Representatives of the State Department, the Treasury, and War Department met day after day of that bright, warm spring, deciding the details of Germany's fate that had been left open by the Big Three. The directive they were writing, Joint Chiefs of Staff 1067, specified to Eisenhower the policy he must adopt towards every institution in Germany. He was to abolish the central government, the Nazi Party, the Wehrmacht, to close schools, universities, radio stations, newspapers, to prevent his soldiers even from speaking to Germans except to give orders. Much of the Morgenthau plan was incorporated in this directive. The French first asked for 1.75 million, but received only about 730,000, possibly 886,000. That was mainly from the U.S. Army. This is the Germans, surrender Germans. In directive, in both spirit and letter, this was largely the work of the three treasury representatives on the committee: Harry Dexter White, Frank Cole, and Harry Glassley, G-L-A-S-S-E-R. Well, I can tell you that Harry Dexter White is not the man you really want to be around, folks, because he's a cat. We'll sometime talk about him. By April, the Allies knew that in the smoking ruins of Germany, the danger was not a sudden surge of militarism, but disease, despair, leading to a communist takeover. This threat worried both Roosevelt and Eisenhower, but to create a Carothene peace, according to military governor Lucas Craig, was precisely the aim of JCS 1067. Howard Trivers, T-R-I-V-E-R-S, a State Department official watching the three Treasury men working on JCS 1067, observed later on. During the committee discussions, these Treasury representatives consistently and persistently argued for the dismemberment of Germany and the transformation of industrial Germany into a bucolic pasture. They were representing faithfully the views of Henry Morgenthau, the Secretary's Treasurer. Later, I wonder whether they had also been acting under Soviet instructions if they really were members of the communist cells. At that time, Stalin was proclaiming that his enemies were the Nazis, not the German people, and the German nation and state would continue after the hostilities in the Union. The Soviets had organized a Free German Committee consisting of communists and POWs and an association of German officers, that is, captured officers, who were espousing the same views about the future. It would have been typical Soviet policy and practice to instruct American communists to support locally the dismemberment and pasteurization of Germany and to seek to determine American policy along these lines. In this way, contrary to the Americans, the Soviets could present themselves to the Germans as the champions of the German national cause. The ultimate aim, of course, veiled it at first, being a united Germany under communism. Ultimately, White was revealed as a subversion who had disobeyed Senate instructions on gold policy in an attempt to destroy the economy of Chiang Kai-shek's China. So we know who he is. He's a mole, folks. He's a spy. And we'll talk more about him hopefully in the future. Morgenthau was in Warm Springs, Georgia, the night before Roosevelt died on April 12th. The president's last words to him on policy were, "Henry, I am with you 100%. Thus, this plan, which imposed a Cartesian peace on Germany, remained an important element of U.S. policy towards the Germans at the time of Roosevelt's death. Together with all other Roosevelt policy, it was adopted and continued by the new president, Harry S. Truman, who made no serious changes in U.S. policy or in the cabinet for several months after Roosevelt died. On April 21st, 1945, another Supreme Commanders of the Allied message signed Eisenhower told Marshall that the new prisoner enclosures will provide no shelter or other comforts. It added that the enclosures would be improved by the prisoners themselves, utilizing local materials. These enclosures were open fields surrounded by barbed wire called prisoners of war's temporary enclosures. They were not temporary, but they were certainly enclosed by barbed wire, searchlights, guard towers, and machine guns. Far from permitting the prisoners to provide shelter utilizing local material, the Army engineer ordered issue on May 1st specifically forbade the provision of housing in the cages. I wonder what the Germans did to the Americans in their prison camps. I'd like to find out. That'd be interesting because I don't think they treated us that way. If the message to Marshall had meant what it said about the prisoners maintaining themselves with local materials, the engineer orders would never have been issued because it directly countermanded what had just been sent to Marshall. The order was allowed to stand. Tents, foods, barbed wire, medical supplies, and so on were scarce in the camps, not because the Army lacked supplies, but because requests for supplies were denied. As Hughes said on March 19 after his visit, the Hughes supply dumps at Naples and Marcellus, Naples all over again. More stocks than we can ever use, stretched as far as the eye can see. He continues 2 days later. Little John says he's under pressure from the U.S. and the ETO because he has cut POW rations. I advise him to take it up with Ike without delay. Ike may not support him. 1 week later, when Little John still had not settled the matter with the War Department, Hughes' comment was, I suppose that we are all afraid of Geneva Convention. Because the International Red Cross delegates were still visiting camps to make reports on the Geneva Convention, the possibility of retaliation against Allied prisoners in Germany's hands was at this time a very live issue with Supreme Allied forces. Eisenhower himself wrote a message telling the combined chiefs of staff on February 18th that the Germans were moving Allied prisoners south and west away from the Russians, exposing them to unusual hardship and hazard. I suggest that proposal be made to the German government by the U.S. and U.K. governments through the protecting powers along the following lines: that the German forces should leave the prisoners of war with adequate supplies, and a nominal role or sufficient description of these releases should be left with the camp leaders and duplicate rendered to the protecting power. All of this indicates a practical familiarity with the routine of a prison camp and the role of various powers under the Geneva Convention. He ends with, this is a matter of extreme urgency. Contrary to Hughes' assumption on March 21st, Little John soon receives approval from Washington to reduce rations. So now the government is actually enforcing this, that we're not doing this. So at one time, Eisenhower was on his own as the Army Chief Commander. Now he's getting support from Washington. That's their policy. Hughes' diary does not say whether Eisenhower intervened directly to defend Little John's actions, but Eisenhower, who called Little John the best quartermaster I know, did not oppose him, according to the cable log. Little John was again reducing rations by April 23rd. This was in line with the U.S. chiefs' usual posture of deferring all questions in the European theater to General Ike, as Eisenhower's good friend Harry C. Butcher, B-U-T-C-H-R, noted in his diary. There was certainly not sufficient rations to properly accommodate this tremendous amount of prisoners of war, wrote Deputy Provost Marshal Lieutenant Colonel Valentine M. Barnes, author of a history of Provost Marshal, advanced section, which most of the prisoners were kept. Is a footnote here stating that at this date, Switzerland was acting as a protecting power in league of the German government. Let's continue. Because the Provost Marshal's office was responsible for the prisoners, Barnes must have known when he wrote his history that there were, in fact, plenty of tents and food in U.S. Army depots in April, but he does not mention why they did not reach the camps. On April 22nd, the Army had in stock in Europe 50-day supplies of nutritional balanced rations that gave 4,000 calories per person per day for 5 million people, although the Army was feeding at least at that time nearly 2.6 million in the military category. Enough supplies of the unbalanced rations were on hand for a further 50 days. This 100-day stockpile remained at the same level all summer. The rule, according to General, as RUHR, the rule was, according to General Smith, was quite plentiful supplied when it was closed in, that is, it doesn't tell us the date, sorry. There was plenty of ammunition. Food was plentiful in some places, and others, the larder were bare. Barnes earnestly outlines the efforts of his men who drove many miles both day and night in April to bring water in barrels to hundreds of thousands of prisoners. While his men drove around with barrels of water, Central German and American supplies were going unused. There were plenty of spare tents to cover the prisoners, as well as German food, medicine, and tents. German supplies were uncovered in huge quantities, but the discovery of useful captured materials did not in itself assure their availability for either military units or civil affairs. The supply officers in the field could not get what they needed for the prisoners because the commanding generals refused to issue it. Bureau Theater Provost Marshal record warning seems to have sunk without a trace except in the archives. Guards, water, food, tent, space, barbed wire, everything necessary for prisoners were kept fatally scarce. Camp Weinberg on the Rhine, 6 miles in circumference, had no food at all when it was opened in April 17th. As in the other big Rhine metal camps, opened in mid-April, there were at first no guard towers, no tents, no buildings, no cooking facilities, no water, no latrines. There was not even enough barbed wire. The official allotment of space was 175 square feet per man, but at Rheinberg and elsewhere for a while the space was anywhere from 50 to half of that. In some camps, the men were so crowded they could not even lie down. The situation at one camp was reported as following. The highest on-hand figure at Continental Central Prisoner of War enclosure, number 18, which had 32,902 prisoners of war. Attention is invited to the fact that the holding capacity of Continental Central Prisoner of War enclosure, number 18, does not exceed between 6,000 to 8,000 prisoners of war. So they're actually 4 times or 5 times what they're supposed to have. So who's making these mistakes? Well, it's definitely the generals at the top. It's not the people at the bottom here. Okay, but they also are not following the Geneva Convention. Again, key. It's just really distressing about what happened. All this happened while the number of prisoners were well inside the range of captures predicted. Marshall was told by Supreme Commander of the forces in Europe, signed by Eisenhower April 21st, that the captures had exceeded all expectations. But the forecast at the beginning of April that the Army would have little over 2 million prisoners by the end of the month was better than 99% accurate. On the April 30, the Army had on hand in Europe 2,62,865 prisoners. So they were only off by 12,000. It's clear that there had been plenty of warning about the huge influx that came in April. Disastrous overcrowding, disease, exposure, and malnutrition were the rule in the U.S. camps in Germany beginning in April, despite the considerable risk that the Germans would retaliate against the millions of Allied hostages in Germany. It was about now that the guards at some German concentration camps speeded the rate of killing, get rid of as many people as they could before the Allies reached them. If they found out about the DEF plan, the Germans would use it as propaganda to prolong the desperate resistance which Eisenhower had deplored. The conditions at the American camps along the Rhine in early April were reserved by 2 U.S. Army colonels, that is James B. Mason and Charles H. Beasley. April 20 was a blistery day with alternate rain, sleet, and snow, and with bone-chilling winds sweeping down the Rhine Valley from the north over the flats where the enclosure was located. Huddled close together for warmth behind the barbed wire was a most awesome sight. Nearly 100,000 haggardly, dirty, gaunt, black-staring men clad in dirty field gray uniforms and standing ankle-deep in mud. Here and there were dirty white blurs which, upon a closer look, were seen to be men with bandages, heads or arms, or standing on shirt sleeves. The German division commander reported that the men had not eaten for at least 2 days and the provision of water was a major problem. Yet only 200 yards away was a river Rhine running bank full. The view from inside the camps was worse. In April 1945, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers, as well as the sick from hospitals, amputees, women, auxiliaries, and civilians were caught. One inmate at Weinberg was over 80 years old. Another was aged 9. Nagging hunger and agonizing thirst were their companions, and they died of dysentery. A crew having held them week after week with streams of rain. Amputees slithered like amphibians through the mud, soaking and freezing. naked to the skies, day after day, day after day, and night after night. They lay desperate in the sand of Rheinberg, or slept exhaustively into the eternal in their collapsing holes. That's my conclusion of chapter 3 tonight. So we're going to conclude that. It's about 50 minutes. This needs to be this people need to know this. You need to know this. You need to know your country did this, folks. This was done over 75 years ago. Yeah, all these people have died pretty much, yes. But this should never happen. But yet our country does this. And we're considered a great country when we do this. Let's remember this whole idea here that the British baited not only the Germans to fight, they also baited the United States to get involved in this war. You see. And so that's my remarks. So I just want to share that with you. So I wish you a good night. Thank you for listening. And I would appreciate if some people would actually start sharing some of these videos that I share. I'm doing this out of a labor for truth. When are you going to start caring, people? When are you going to start caring? Have a good night. Take care.